A little less than 2 years ago, back in October of 2022, I released the pilot episode of the Humble Skeptic podcast, and on that program, I discussed my dad's story of seeing Billy Joel perform at a piano bar in Los Angeles in the days before he became famous. Since that particular bar served as the inspiration for the song Piano Man, I wondered what my dad might be able to tell me about his experience there. Had he met any of the famous characters from the song, like John the bartender, Paul the real estate novelist, or Davy in the Navy? If you've had a chance to listen to that episode, you know the story. But if you're new to this podcast, let me recommend that you stop right here and click the link to the pilot episode that I've included in the show notes. Not only is that episode a lot of fun, but most of what you're about to hear on this program won't make sense unless you listen to that show first.
Faith is believing in something you can't see, you can't feel, something that can't be proven.
Then how do you know which is the right faith?
I think that's a gut thing.
I don't think about a right faith. I think about what resonates with me. I feel authentic. It brings me peace.
I think there is no absolute truth in any religion. I think it's a matter of subjective experience.
I kind of just trust my intuition, trust my gut.
You just know. You just gotta follow it.
You just gotta follow what you think is your faith.
If faith is blind, then what makes one belief better or worse than any other? And if it's just a leap in the dark, why should any of us feel obligated to believe anything at all? My name is Shane Rosenthal. I was raised in a Jewish home but became an atheist at a very young age. Later, as I began to question things, I ended up losing faith in my atheism and converted to Christianity. Since that time, I've never stopped asking questions, and I've spoken with authors and scholars from all over the world in order to explore the beliefs and ideas that shape our lives. Over the years, one thing I've concluded is this: we're all believers. But because there are so many conflicting ideas and worldviews out there, we just can't all be right. So how do we find the truth? On this podcast, we'll start by asking questions.
I'm really just trying to figure out what I believe right now.
Hey there, welcome to another episode of the Humble Skeptic Podcast. I'm your host, Shane Rosenthal, and on this program I'll be revisiting the subject that I explored on the pilot episode related to the location of the Executive Room Cocktail Lounge, which served as the inspiration for Billy Joel's Piano Man. If you heard that episode, you'll recall that a few years ago, my dad mentioned in passing that he happened to see Billy Joel perform at this bar in the days before he became famous. Since I had never heard him tell this story before, I began asking him all kinds of questions about his time at the bar, and even began to wonder whether he could have been one of the characters mentioned in the famous song. Now, when I spoke to my brother about all this, a quick Wikipedia search informed him that Billy Joel worked at this bar at a time when we lived on the other side of the country. When he informed me of this, I went from solid faith to radical doubt in the span of a few minutes. One of the reasons I like to tell this story is that it helps us to understand the relationship between faith and doubt. You see, we often find things believable because of prior beliefs and commitments. For example, when my dad first told me his story, because of my long-time relationship with him, I took him at his word. In other words, because I knew him to be trustworthy, I trusted him. But when I discovered that my dad's story conflicted with other known facts, that's when doubts began to emerge. This, of course, implies that I also trusted the new information I received from Wikipedia. When I read on that site that Billy Joel performed at the Executive Room for 6 months from 1972 to 1973, it just seemed more likely that my dad had confused some other lounge singer for Billy Joel, since we lived in West Virginia at the time. But when my mom mentioned in passing that Dad took a business trip to LA in the spring of '73, suddenly his story became plausible again. When I first started asking questions related to Billy Joel's time at the Executive Room, I discovered that there was a lot of conflicting information online. In fact, things I read on Wikipedia differed significantly from things I found at BillyJoel.com. After questioning things and doing my own research, I discovered comments from Billy Joel himself which invalidated some of the information that was posted on his own website. The reason I call this show the Humble Skeptic Podcast is due to the fact that we live in an age with a great deal of conflicting information on a host of different fronts. And in such a time, I'm convinced that the best way forward in the midst of any given conflict is to foster a healthy skepticism about not only the things that other people believe, but also the things that we ourselves believe. Now, the kind of skepticism I encourage is investigative. It's a posture that isn't afraid of examining one's own foundation and asking, have I got this right? After doubting some of my initial assumptions related to my dad's story, I eventually stumbled onto evidence that was hard to dismiss. When I compared some of the specific details he mentioned with information I found in various biographies about Billy Joel, even comments made by the singer himself, I became convinced that my dad really had visited the bar made famous in the song Piano Man. But as I later discovered, new information would eventually turn up that would challenge those convictions. One of the things I discussed on the pilot episode is the fact that my dad placed the location of the executive room on the corner of Western and Wilshire, in the lobby of a large office building. But this conflicts with information I was able to discover online. Bob Egan, who is the owner of a site called Pop Spots, did some investigative work of his own back in 2014 and discovered a picture of the bar near the corner of Wilshire and Gramercy, which is over 3 blocks further west from the location my dad visited. The image he posted on his site revealed that the famous cocktail lounge was a single-story building situated between a deli and a Chinese restaurant, and that it was not located in the lobby of a large office building, as my dad had stated. Now, on the pilot episode of this podcast, I threw out the suggestion that the executive room may have changed locations sometime after 1973 while Billy Joel worked there, and 1978 when the photo was taken. But in subsequent email conversations with Bob Egan, I was informed that according to phone books dating back to 1970, the address of the famous bar listed the location shown in the image on his website. In other words, the theory I put forward was incorrect. When I pointed out to Bob that Billy Joel stated on multiple occasions that the bar was located on Western and Wilshire, his response was that Billy Joel was likely speaking in general terms only, giving major cross streets that were close to the bar's location. I also discovered a television segment from ABC's 2020 on the life of Billy Joel dating back to 1980 that included an exterior shot of the executive room featuring the same building shown on Bob Egan's website. This program also featured interviews with some of the patrons who remembered Billy Joel's time at the bar. Here's a clip from that show.
She's got a way about her.
This is Cold Spring Harbor. You won't find it in most record stores. It was recorded at the wrong speed. Now, if you were a young songwriter getting into the music business and your producer made a mistake like that, you might do what Billy Joel did.
I was getting ripped off. So how was I going to get all the things back that I signed away? Well, I'm going to sit these people out. I'm going to disappear off the face of the earth.
And disappear is just what Billy Joel did. Under the alias of Bill Martin, he took a job playing at a small piano bar in downtown Los Angeles. If you drive down Wilshire Boulevard, way downtown, you'll find it. It's called the Executive Room.
It's 9 o'clock on a Saturday.
Today, some of the regulars still remember the man who called himself Bill Martin.
And he was kind of like hiding out. And he needed something to tie him over for 6 or 8 months.
Played the old standards.
Let's face it, he didn't think he'd be caught in a place like this.
Sing us a song, you're the piano man. Sing us a song tonight.
When I shared a link to this 2020 segment with Bob Egan, he wrote me back saying that this was proof that Billy Joel played at this place rather than at the office building on Western and Wilshire. Then he sent me a YouTube video featuring an Australian pop singer by the name of Liam Cooper, who performs the song Piano Man in all of his concerts, and in this particular video, Liam interviewed one of the former owners of the executive room. Here's a clip from the introduction.
Hi there, Liam Cooper here. I am an entertainer. My show, King of the Keys, celebrates the music of the greatest piano man of all time. In this show, and basically for my whole entire life as a piano man, I've played Billy Joel's Piano Man. This year is the 50th anniversary of the song, and I always in my shows share the story behind this song, which in a nutshell is 1971, Billy Joel releases his first album. He has a falling out with this record label. He moves over to LA, where he hides out for a couple of years while lawyers get him out of this contract. While he's there, he starts playing at a bar called the Executive Room for about 6 months. Years after that, a couple named Roy and Jill come into the picture. Jill's father and a group of other people buy this bar and continue to operate it until the mid-80s. Developers then come along and buy the property that the bar is in, they knock it down and put a strip mall up. But the piano is kept by Roy and Jill, and right now they are in Florida. I found all this out because a blog writer named Bob Egan, he has a blog called Potspots. He publishes articles about the locations and places behind iconic images, album covers, artworks in pop culture. And he wrote an article about the Executive Room and how it was demolished. There was no Google Street View at the time, so there were no pictures. He found a picture of the Executive Room in the LA County Library image archives. Bob publishes this article. Roy finds out about it and sends in a bunch of pictures and other elements to the story about Piano Man and the Executive Room. This is how I came to know the story of the Executive Room, but also about Roy and Jill owning the piano. And I thought it would be a great idea to connect with Roy and Jill and do something with the piano. I'm hoping maybe that I can get over there at some point to play Piano Man on this iconic piano.
Liam Cooper is such a huge fan of Piano Man that someday he'd like to play on the piano that was rescued from the Executive Room before it was demolished. But the key takeaway from the clip we just heard is that the former owner seemed to confirm the location of the bar that is featured at Bob Egan's website. And in the clip you're about to hear from Liam's conversation with Roy, the former owner also mentions the fact that he got to know some of the memorable characters mentioned in Piano Man. Take a listen.
So Billy plays at the piano by 1972. At what point do you and your wife Jill come into it?
Yeah, it was long after he was gone, several years. About 1980, I'd say. And Jill moved to Los Angeles and kind of became the manager of the Executive Room for them.
Did you own the bar up until the bar was demolished?
Yes.
So you obviously identify that the piano has some value because you could have just left it there.
Well, we had heard, about the Piano Man and that all the characters in the song, we knew all of them.
So I love that you bring up the people in this song. Are there any that stand out to you? There's John, the bartender, Paul, the real estate novelist, Davey from the Navy.
Jill had mentioned several times that John, the bartender, he was still behind the bar when we took it over. Paul was still the regular. Davey, he was actually in the Merchant Marines. But I guess that's the Navy.
I mean, Merchant Marines doesn't have the same lyrical flow that Navy does and rhyming possibilities.
Sometimes when you're asking honest questions, you don't have any idea where the evidence will take you. But that's kind of the point. If, like me, you want to believe true things, then you have to follow the evidence, even when it takes you places you'd prefer not to go. This is essentially what happened to me when I lost faith in atheism. I wasn't looking to become a religious person, but when I found evidence for God's existence and the trustworthiness of both the Old and New Testaments, I ended up converting to Christianity even though it cost a few friendships and was awkward for members of my immediate family. Well, thus far I've presented some of the difficulties with my dad's story, but I also encountered other evidence that seemed to confirm his account. For example, last November, Billy Joel recorded an interview related to the 50th anniversary of Piano Man, and at one point in the conversation, the host asked him if he ever went back to visit the Executive Room bar after he became famous. Here's his answer.
Well, I tried to go back to see the place after I moved back to the East Coast. This was on Wilshire Boulevard and Wilshire and Western, which is called the Wilshire District. And I drove to where the bar used to be, but it was gone. I think there's like an insurance building or something there. or maybe even condominiums. But the bar was gone, and the people, used to hang out at the bar. They were gone too. I don't know where any of them ended up.
On its own, that wasn't enough to convince the owner of the Pop Spots website, but it was enough for me to continue my investigation. At one point, I even tried sending an email to Billy Joel himself through one of his agents. I still haven't received a response to that one. However, I did eventually get a reply from someone else who was connected to Billy Joel. At the time, he worked at the executive room.
I'm John Gibson. For most of my career, 50 some odd years, I was a broadcaster, last on Fox News Channel as both a TV anchor and a radio host, and before that, MSNBC and NBC, and then local news. But very early in my career, I was in the music business, which is where I encountered Billy Joel, among others.
In his book, Billy Joel, The Life and Times of an Angry Young Man, Hank Bordowitz says that when Billy Joel moved to California in 1972, he ended up renting the home of John and Sandy Gibson. Though I remembered John Gibson as a TV news personality on Fox News and other TV networks, back in 1972, he worked for Atlantic Records and was trying to get Billy Joel to sign with his record label. When I stumbled on a way to contact Gibson at one point in my research, I sent him an email and asked if he'd be willing to join me for a conversation on my podcast about the time he worked with Billy Joel. And to my surprise, he agreed. Now, since John Gibson served as a TV news anchor for several decades, I also decided to ask him a variety of questions related to that part of his career as well. So here's my conversation with John Gibson. So you've been in the world of television news for several decades, and one of the biggest stories I recall seeing you cover was the O.J. Simpson trial back in the mid-90s. What network did you work for back in those days?
What happened was in 1992, I was at San Francisco Bureau covering news in San Francisco. And in 92, I went to work for NBC in the Burbank Bureau as a correspondent. After a year, they fired me. But another part of NBC, which was called the News Channel, they needed a correspondent in LA. So I was hired back immediately to do that. And that's when OJ killed his wife. I took my hand there. And I began doing the OJ trial, and that lasted every day for a year and a half.
Now, back in the late 60s or early 70s, you actually began your career in the music industry. How did that come about?
Well, I came out of the UCLA Film School in 1969, and I became friends with a record producer named Bones Howe. And Bones recommended me for a job at the Hollywood Reporter, reviewing music acts at the Whiskey and the Troubadour and places like that, and concerts. So after a few years of the Hollywood Reporter, I went to work for a magazine called Record World, which is now defunct. And a guy named Earl McGrath recruited me to go to work for Atlantic. And I was there about a year and worked with the Eagles and Hall & Oates and some others. And after about a year, I decided that music business wasn't right for me, which was probably a bad decision. I should have stayed. I'd not only be retired today, but I'd have a lot more money. and so that's when I decided, well, I need to go back to the news business. And that's when I started as a writer at KFWB and then KEYT in Santa Barbara.
So you work with the Eagles. That would have been like in their heyday.
It wasn't their heyday yet.
Okay.
I had the distinction of at Atlantic of working with artists that later became big, but under my tutelage remained obscure. So the Eagles had released a Desperado album. I worked with them on that, and it didn't really do anything for a long time. It kind of became a classic later. And the same thing with Hall & Oates. It was my job, supposedly, to make these new artists at Atlantic into a hit, and I didn't know what I was doing. I had no idea how to do that, and I wasn't very good at it. It was one of the reasons that I decided really the music business wasn't for me.
Well, the reason I've asked you to join me for an episode of my podcast is that one of the artists that you were involved with back in 1972 was none other than Billy Joel. So how did you first get connected with him?
My ex-wife was working for Artie Ripp at
Family Records.
Yeah. And I don't think anybody disputes this. Artie's still alive, but calls me once in a while. And he did that record, Cold Spring Harbor, I think it was called. And Billy didn't like what went on.
He says he sounded like a chipmunk, that, it was recorded at a different speed or something to that effect.
Yeah, I think they put a very speed on it, or I don't know what Artie did, but Billy was very unhappy with it. So he decided he'd sit out the contract with Artie and force Artie to sell it to somebody. So right at that moment, I was hired by Atlantic. So I was leaving my house in Malibu. I bought this house for $40,000. I bought this house in the Malibu Hills, which Zillow now says is $4.4 million. So I was moving to New York, work for Atlantic, and Billy rented my house.
What did you charge him for rent?
$150.
Wow.
And Billy moved in, and he needed to make money to pay the rent. So he got this job at the piano bar at the Executive.
Yeah, I also read that your ex-wife, Sandy, is the one who drove him around looking for work. And that's how he did get the job at the Executive Room on Wilshire. Is that your understanding, too, that she's the one that drove him to that establishment?
I don't remember that at all. I mean, maybe it's true.
Okay.
I don't remember.
I think she was quoted as saying that she drove him at first to a place called Corky's in the Valley. Anyway, it's amazing what you find when you're investigating things. I tell this story on my podcast, so most of my listeners will be familiar with some of these events, because I talked to my dad about this. He said that at one point he saw Billy Joel perform at a bar that was on Western and Wilshire, and this was before the days when Billy Joel became famous. And when I started looking into the details of those stories, I found all kinds of conflicting information online, which is something you probably are familiar with as you're trying to gather evidence and facts to tell a news story. Sometimes you get conflicting sources of information. The primary site that I found has images of the Executive Room on what looks like Western and Gramercy. It's like a single-story building between a deli and a Chinese restaurant. But my dad said that he was in a large office building, and there was a bank on one side and the bar on the right. So I'm wondering whether you can help clear things up for us. You said in your email to me that you had been there a few times, so I'm wondering who's right, my dad or the internet?
Dad. At the time that Billy was in the Executive Room, it was a bar on the ground floor of an office building.
There you go.
And I only went there after hours. It was something you went to at night. So basically the building was shut down except for the bar. And it was definitely in an office building.
Do you remember anything about the lobby of that place or what the front of the Executive Room looked like?
I mean, it was a door on the street separate from the door of the lobby. So you didn't have to go through the lobby to get to the bar.
Would that have been Western Avenue Street or Wilshire?
Wilshire.
Okay, all right.
And there was an easel out in front with a big cardboard sign. It had a lot of sparkles on it and stars and a picture of Billy. And it said, at the piano, Bill Martin.
Yeah, Bill Martin that's right, because he was using a pseudonym in those days.
Yeah. And when you went into the place, it was very dark and smoky. And there was a bar. And at the end of the bar was a piano.
Yeah. When you were there, was it like a large place with 100 people in there or more like 10 to 20, like a typical bar?
Oh, no. Maybe 30 or 40 tops.
Yeah.
And, would sit at the bar or near the piano bar and talk to him between songs and other people would talk to him. And there was a big jar there and people put tip money in it. And I brought in at least once and maybe twice people from Atlantic because I knew Billy's contract was for sale. And one of them was Earl McGrath, who was the guy who had recruited me into Atlantic.
One of your emails, you said that the song Piano Man almost perfectly describes what was going on in that place, right down to people putting bread in his jar and saying, man, what are you doing here? Do you actually recall anybody saying something like that to Billy Joel?
No, but I can imagine because I was thinking the same thing. If I didn't know what he was doing there, I would have said it. I mean, I knew because, I knew the story of what was going on with Artie, and he was sitting out his contract and living in my house, and yeah, there's no reason for Billy Joel to have been in a piano bar, on Wilshire, other than the fact that he was trying to get out of his really abusive contract.
Do you remember meeting any of the famous characters that are mentioned in the song, like John the bartender, Paul the real estate novelist, or Davy in the Navy?
No, but there's such vivid descriptions, and I think that just going in their bar, looking at the people who were sitting at the piano bar, that was like their seats. They were there to see Billy and drink, and they knew him, and they threw money in his jar, and they talked to him and lit his cigarettes, and they always say, write what you know, and Billy knew that scene really well.
Yeah. Yeah. So you were trying to get him signed with Atlantic. And so I'm wondering what you first thought about that song once you heard it on the radio. Like, wish I had that one.
Oh, sure. In my period in the record business, it was the record business, and you had to sell a physical object. And, I was connected with a bunch of artists that had unknown and not so certain futures who have turned out to be giants.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I knew that was a great song. But, in those days, God, there was a lot of great stuff. This great song that we love, it would only reach number 20 because there were 20 other great ones above it. Now, having said that, I listened to Sirius 70s on 7, and there's all that great music, and then there's a huge amount of junk, which I will, call disco. And every time that comes on, I got to change this, because almost anything could get recorded in those days and get put out, and didn't take all that much to get on the charts.
Let me ask you a couple more questions to sort of corroborate my dad's story. Now, was your dad was he Davy in the Navy, or was he the real estate novelist? I asked him a whole bunch of questions like that. My dad just stopped in there for 1 hour. He had an interview in that building, came down, got a drink, 1 hour. So he wasn't a regular. He didn't know any of the other guys. He didn't talk politics with the waitress, but he could tell me some things about the place. For example, he did say exactly what you said, that the piano was right at the end of the bar. And he said the front of the building was made of glass. And he said he even described the tip jar. And I'm wondering, how would you describe the kind of tip jar that Billy Joel used?
I seem to remember it's a big bell-shaped glass jar.
Yeah. It basically, what I read from a biography was that it was a brandy snifter, a large brandy snifter. And that's exactly what my dad said. Well, how would you describe the piano? Was it a grand piano or an upright?
It was not an upright. It was probably a baby grand. And, the lid was down because he had stuff on top of the lid. And it was cocked a little sideways. So he wasn't behind the piano. He was kind of closer to the bar. So he was closer to the customer. So it was a little bit like he performs now. He's sitting sideways on the stage looking out at people. And that's kind of how it was then.
All right. Well, thank you for corroborating my dad's story. Before I let you go, one last question. You've served many, many moons in the TV journalism world. What do you think about the state of journalism in our day?
I hate the word journalism. It just covers so much crap these days. I always call myself a reporter. You're a reporter. You go out and report what you see, what you find out. And I find out these schools of journalism in like Missouri, they cover PR, advertising, and so you find people in so-called journalism today who are really just political advocates. I think it's a mess. Look, I have to take some of the blame. When we finished the OJ story, after a year and a half, and the country totally obsessed, 2 billionaires made important decisions, Rupert Murdoch and Bill Gates, and they decided that, having had the example of the OJ thing going on continuously for a year and a half, that they could compete with CNN with full-time news networks. So Gates poured money into what became MSNBC, and I was one of the anchors on the first day of MSNBC, and MSNBC started in 96. I was there 4 years, and then I went to Fox. Well, the truth of the matter is there is not 24 hours worth of news. And so you have two choices if you recognize that. One is we do a wheel, which is basically what KFWB was. Every 20 minutes, we repeat things and update it as you go through the clock. Or you do a lot of opinion. And cable news has become a huge amount of opinion and some news. I do tune in whenever there's news to see what's going on. But as soon as they run out of gas on the news and I can smell it, I go, okay, I'm going back to watching baseball because at least something interesting is happening.
Do you think too many times the reporters are not calling balls and strikes? They're not just explaining the facts, but it is opinion-led. It's more about putting forward their theories?
Well, I mean, let's make a distinction between the news reporters at all these places and the anchors and the hosts. Anchors, hosts. The reporters are still out there reporting the news, and they're in there somewhere. You got to watch for them. But basically, the anchors and the hosts, it's all point of view. It's all opinion. Leavened with a few facts here and there. Well-chosen facts. I know that I did it for a long time. I plead guilty. I get it. But, yeah, that's what it is.
Yep. It just seems like there's a lack of curiosity on the news side. It's almost like if a political candidate makes a claim, you just take his word for it and you don't question it. You don't ask the tough questions to try to get the bottom of the story. It's almost like you're putting out their press release without any challenges.
You have to remember that what's going on now is that in a large swath of the media, there is an opinion that we cannot let Donald Trump be president again. We just can't. And it doesn't matter what the old rules are. We're going to do whatever we have to do to make sure he's not president again. Whatever you feel about Trump, I think it's only fair to recognize that the media is lined up to do their best, make sure that he doesn't get back in the White House. They are irrationally frightened about him and will do and say virtually anything. Even I think a person who tends to vote for Kamala because they don't want Trump to be president. Okay, fine. That's your opinion. I get it. You get to vote. Do what you want. But to be honest, you got to recognize they are going over her history now and cleaning it up. She is pretty far left, and they're trying to pretend that she isn't. I mean, I just think that in our highly politicized and partisan times, the media is taking sides. They're putting on jerseys. I'm on the red team. I'm on the blue team. And in order for you to get a sense of what's real, you have to be like a baleen whale and go through a school of shrimp, reading and consuming it all to sort out what's real and what's not.
It's sort of like my experience on the Billy Joel side. I mean, the only way that I could get confidence when I was comparing the two different sides of the stories was for me to do the investigative work and to sort of take the time to own for myself what really happened. And I think too many times as media consumers, I'm going to go to the outlet of choice. This network tilts my direction, and it's only going to serve up for me that which I prefer, instead of actually digging up the facts and getting to the bottom of it.
Yeah, I mean, look, I plead guilty. I did it. I mean, I know. But, I mean, I just think that people today, when it comes to the media writ large, all of it, you have to sort through it.
Right.
And make sure that you toss out the most outrageous claims. I mean, I tell you what Wikipedia is good for. I mean, as you discovered because of this business of the bar, there's all kinds of false claims in Wikipedia. But what tends to not be false are the notes.
Yep.
Down to the bottom, they source where this came from and that came from. And if you go down to the bottom and look at the original published stuff, you can decide for yourself whether the claim up above is true. And the guy who claims that the executive room was in this little building, he's probably right. It probably was at one time.
Yeah.
There's a bar on 47th Street in New York for years and years and years. Next to Fox, it was called Studio L, Langan's, and it was where Fox people went. Well, Langan's closed down during COVID, but here it is popping up again 4 or 5 years later in a slightly different location, 3/4 of a block away. A number of years from now, people are going to have arguments. Well, wait a minute.
Yeah. Sometimes history is complicated, and, it takes the job of the historian or a reporter. The job is to sort of make the complicated thing accessible and digestible. And sometimes in that process of making it easy and accessible, sometimes things are smoothed over. When I'm trying to sort through the conflicting evidence, it took a while to figure it. But I finally found my bearings. And thanks to you, I have absolute confirmation from another eyewitness. You were at the executive room, and the key idea was that it was on the ground floor of an office building. That's what cinches it for me.
Yeah, I mean, it just was. I mean, look, your dad isn't making it up. Whatever the circumstances were, him flying into LA for a business meeting, goes down and has a drink. I mean, whatever it was, that hour that he was there, he was right. That was the place. That's what it looked like. And I'm telling you, it was in an office building.
John Gibson, thanks so much for being my guest on the Humble Skeptic podcast.
Yeah, it was fun. Nice talking to you.
So how are we to explain the discrepancies that still remain? According to phone book records, there was only one address for the executive room from 1970 until 1985, and that address matches the single-story building on Wilshire and Gramercy. But according to two credible eyewitnesses, Billy Joel performed at a bar in the lobby of a large office building on Wilshire and Western. Not only has their testimony been independently corroborated, but it also fits with various statements made by Billy Joel himself. The bar is no longer there, he said, but the building remains. It was an insurance building or condominiums, which again is a perfect fit for the Pierce National Life Building on Western and Wilshire. So what kind of evidence carries more weight? Should we put more faith in phone book records or in eyewitness testimony? Is there a possible solution that might help to resolve the remaining conflict? That's what I'll be discussing next time on the Humble Skeptic podcast. And until then, be sure to check out the show notes for all kinds of information related to this episode, including images related to the two locations of the executive room. As always, the Humble Skeptic podcast is listener supported. And if you'd like to help with this work, you can make a one-time gift or upgrade to a paid subscription via Substack. To all my supporters, thank you so much for making this work possible. And I look forward to being with you again next time as we discuss the beliefs and ideas that shape our lives. There's one more thing I'd like you to know. At one point in my research, I thought it might be interesting to experiment with artificial intelligence. Liam Cooper spoke to Roy about his involvement with the executive room starting back in 1980, but I wanted to know who owned the bar while Billy Joel worked there, to see if I could get confirmation that the bar had a second location. So I set up an AI account and entered the question, who owned the executive room where Billy Joel performed as a lounge singer back in 1973? And here's the answer I received.
The executive room in Los Angeles, where Billy Joel performed in 1973, was owned by John and Sandy Gibson.
What?